Welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the New Press. We are a independent nonprofit publisher publishing books in the public interest. And this event tonight is a discussion between New Press author Greg Mitchell, whose books include The Tunnels, The Campaign of the Century, winner of the Goldsmith Book Prize and finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Tricky Dick and the Pink Lady, a New York Times notable book, So Wrong for So Long, and with Robert J. Lifton, Hiroshima in America, and Who Owns Death. Most recently, he's the author of The Beginning or the End, published by the New Press this year, about the ill-fated first movie to be made about the atomic bomb. He lives in New York. And joining Greg, we have director Rod Lurie. He's an Oscar-nominated director whose films include The Contender, The Last Castle, and Straw Dogs. Most recently, he directed The Outpost, which has just been released, an adaptation of a book by CNN host Jake Tapper on the courageous stand made by a small group of US soldiers against hundreds of Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. So they're here to discuss Greg's new book, and I will turn it over to Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. I should say I'm a director of an Oscar-nominated film, but I'm not actually Oscar-nominated myself. You know, we call that fake valor in the military, and I certainly don't want to do that. Greg, it's really fantastic for us to be doing this together, and I'm really delighted because your book right here, it's The Beginning or the End, is the name of the book. And let me ask you first, I'll let you explain. The Beginning or the End was a motion picture in 1947, I believe.
Right, correct.
And wanted to tell everyone who has not read your book yet what The Beginning or the End was about.
Okay. Well, it was a movie created by MGM that was inspired by the use of the atomic bomb, creation and use of the atomic bomb, which was exploded over Hiroshima for the first time exactly 75 years ago as we speak. It's actually already 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima right now. So we're
not exactly 12, it's 12:15, isn't it? Our time. I'm sorry, 4:15 our time. It should be the anniversary.
No, it's actually happening. It's 13 hours ahead, but
13. Oh, I
13,
see.
yeah, not to get bogged down in that, but
okay.
Anyway, so the 75 years ago, and then we exploded the bomb over Nagasaki 3 days later, and 2 months later, MGM launched this movie that would be called The Beginning or the End. It was inspired oddly by Donna Reed's high school chemistry teacher who had disappeared into the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge and wrote her a note saying, Hollywood must make a movie warning the world about the coming dangers of nuclear weapons, all the nuclear arms race, all the horrible things that atomic scientists were raising as an issue. Louis B. Mayer of MGM launched the movie, saying it would be the most important movie he had ever made.
Right.
And it would reflect the views of the scientists, raise questions about the use of the bomb against Hiroshima and so forth. The book then is about really what happened in the 12 months after that, where this movie that started out in that direction then went completely in the other direction after script approval essentially was given to President Truman and to General Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. So the book charts, sometimes in very entertaining, bizarre ways, how the movie was completely changed to reflect the official narrative of the bombing.
So what we're dealing with here, just so everybody who's listening understands, this book is a wonderful morphing of two of my favorite genres. One is the World War II history book, which this very, very much is, and also the making of books. You know, like there was a book called The Devil's Candy by I think her name was Julie Solomon, about the making of the bonfire of the vanities. That's wonderfully entertaining because there's no place other than maybe the current Washington, D.C., where you have more gigantic egos than Hollywood. And so it's the morphing of these two. And we'll get into a little bit more about some of the TikTok of all this, which is so entertaining. But I want everyone to sort of understand where you stand, because probably the biggest question of 20th century history the most debated question is, should we have dropped, Fat Man, Little Boy? Should they have been dropped? There is on the one hand, there was the saving of American lives, and on the other hand, there was the notion that Japan was ready to fold, and would have folded quite easily. Where do you stand on this?
Okay. Well, I think my stand a bit has evolved over the years, where I used to be much more, and still am much more interested in what happens next in the nuclear arena. And I guess what it came to me was that what happens next and what happened then are completely intertwined, because what the use of the two weapons, and you can talk about the history and the evidence on all sides for days, but what we signaled was that these weapons were usable, not only because we used them, but because in the 75 years since, officials, the military, and by and large, the media overwhelmingly, many historians have endorsed that use. And so what comes down to policymakers today and presidents, is that these weapons are potentially usable. And we have, in fact, the US has a first use policy today, which gives the president, sort of enables him to go first with nuclear weapons. So the continuing to endorse what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki has a big impact today. Now, of course, you can debate, again, why the bombs were used and should they not have been used. So, but the book, again, it seems like it's a book about a movie, how serious could it be? But what happened with the movie perfectly charts what happened with the story of the bomb, the suppression of evidence, the cover up, if you will, the shaping of this narrative, which is going on to this day, which is only the bomb could end the war. The bomb, in fact, ended the war. It saved, 1 million American lives. There were no other alternatives. And it was basically the right thing to do. And so the movie perfectly reflects the forming of that narrative, the defense of that narrative, the incredible lengths that people went to. And again, in a lively way, it's Hollywood. But, the direct intervention of President Truman and General Groves and others, shows how serious this was in a kind of, as Hollywood is not always the most serious place. So,
so I don't think I've quite gotten the answer from you that I was looking for. I still don't know definitively which way you will lean, but I guess it's not really important, because I don't really think you take a position, and as far as what I've read, you don't really take a position in the book. That the book is like it's a very good historical but very well written and entertaining TikTok of what happened. And in fact, what I find most amusing is that there were two competing companies, MGM and
Paramount,
are trying to be the first to make their atomic bomb movie, because it's a feel-good movie, as far as they're concerned.
We won, right? We won. We created it and we won.
we won, and as far as Hollywood is concerned, we dropped an atomic bomb and obliterated these people that back then we didn't even view as people, really. Right, so it was more palatable that we dropped a bomb on Europe. It is, in my opinion, unlikely that it would have been as celebrated, because they look like us, right?
Right. Okay.
But these guys didn't. Also, these guys attacked us. So everything about it made it palatable to the United States population what had just happened. So they rushed to make these movies. Right. And in order to get the movies made, they cut deals with, and in fact, Paramount cut a deal with Oppenheimer, right? And one of the leading scientists in Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. And MGM is cutting a deal with Leslie Groves, the very, very fat general. And he was, that guy was massive.
He was the fat man.
Well, listen, I went to West Point. There was nobody that was literally half his size.
Yeah.
Okay, literally half his size. But they also cut a deal with Truman. They essentially gave Harry Truman final cut over the film.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit about how these deals were made?
Well, they wanted to, despite starting out with a script that was more reflective of the scientist, they also wanted to be able to portray leading figures in making the bomb in Hollywood. You had to get the rights to these people back then. I'm not sure they'd have to today, but anyway, and they really wanted Grove's cooperation and the military's cooperation. And so they not only got him his approval, but they gave him $10,000 as an advisor, which was completely unprecedented and was really against the military rules. $10,000 then was the equivalent of $130,000.
And he is a sitting general at this point. He still has
brigadier general, the general, yeah. And he was still running the Manhattan Project. So once they did that, and they ran every script past him, and the book charts his dozens and dozens of orders to change things. Some of them, quite silly, like he didn't want to be portrayed eating a lot of chocolate. He thought that was embarrassing. But with Truman, the same thing. They wanted to get permission to be able to portray him on the screen, and they didn't want to go against what was clearly the popular mood of the time, which was, as you said, endorsing the use of the bomb. It was still popular. And so raising questions about that, I think MGM realized, even though they were on board with it at the start, might have hurt the box office. So they were, happily went along with that new change in direction. You mentioned Paramount, and they did the same thing, and they hired Ayn Rand as the screenwriter.
Right.
And again,
right.
Something we could go in, but that's a whole subplot in the book, quite extensive. The saga of Ayn Rand writing this atomic bomb movie, which ultimately was so wacky that Paramount sold out to MGM, and her movie did not go forward. But the impulse was the same, to defend the use of the bomb. But I will say, before going forward, I think the book does, in the end, take a stand about the use of the bomb. I came to feel that the bomb, other alternatives should have been pursued, could have been pursued, that the war, quite possibly, of no guarantee, would have ended or could have ended in the same time frame. There were there were Truman advisors who felt that way, including John J. McLeod. Eisenhower, of course, famously was against the use of the bomb. Admiral Leahy, the chief of staff.
I believe Nimitz was against it as well.
Yeah. So, now it's, of course, people feel you're anti-military if you're, if you raise questions about the bomb, but that was not true. And it's not true back then. So, but in any case, I think in the book, what I try to do is sort of, in a way, get that message out through this vehicle of looking at this Hollywood movie. So you get kind of the entertaining or lighter side, but on a deadly serious subject. And in the end, I hope people come away with more questions, and not just that, MGM censored and suppressed, and Louis B. Mayer was an arch conservative, and so on and so forth. So,
well, in point of fact, Truman, one of his big objections, I guess it was in the screenplay. Was it in the screenplay or the movie? That he didn't care for how he was waffling on the decision, that he was indecisive, that he was wondering whether or not it was the right thing to do. The impression that he wanted the film to give is that it was the absolute right decision to make. And
an easy decision. The key was that it was an easy, because if it's easy, then why would anyone question it? Because it was so.
And this is the first time, really. I have heard, as a cadet and as a student of the war, and in particular the dropping of the atomic bomb, I had always heard this, what I think is mythology, that we're going to lose 1 million men if we storm Japan. And it seems to me that from reading the book, that really wasn't even what Truman was actually hearing. that this was to be exaggerated in the film in order to make it an even more palatable idea to drop the atomic bomb.
Yeah, he, as you say, or the book in a way climaxes, I suppose, with the Truman and his press secretary ordering MGM to reshoot an entire scene. They'd had a scene showing Truman making the decision, and the White House, again, totally unprecedented, totally without any example in the past, ordering MGM to reshoot the scene, and they fired the actor playing Truman because he lacked military bearing, according to the White House. So, a new actor, new scene, and the scene, shows Truman acting very and explaining this narrative. Again, we keep coming back to this official narrative of Hiroshima, and it gave Truman a chance to explain and really establish this narrative that again, using the bomb was the only thing that could be done. There was no alternative. And, again, people who want to dive into this subject, which I encourage them to do, it's really the whole point, isn't it? Not to necessarily see it as black and white by any means, but the two key things that are omitted from the movie and from articles we've seen this past week, and the History Channel had a 2-hour special the other night, didn't even mention the fact that Russia entered the war in the same week, which we had demanded. Truman had demanded, Stalin had just agreed. Truman knew this was going to happen around August 9th. And Truman himself wrote in his diary. Pardon?
I'm sorry, August 9th was Nagasaki Day.
Yeah, well, right. that was Stalin's agreement. He actually declared war on August 8th, I believe.
Right, okay.
But Truman himself in his diary twice makes reference to he uses the expression "finny Japs" when that occurs, referring to the Russians declaring war. Nothing to do with the atomic bomb. So Truman himself knew the tremendous impact Russia's entry would have on the Japanese, who hated the Russians much more than they hated us. And that's totally left out of many histories, not all histories, but many accounts. So, and the other thing briefly is just that we eventually, again, some of Truman's top advisors said if we tell them in advance they can keep their emperor, that alone may encourage them to surrender. And in fact, we refused to do that. But when after we dropped the bomb, we allowed it.
We allowed it, right? We could, and I think it's absolutely, in my opinion, it's absolutely correct that the Japanese would not just have surrendered, but might easily have happily surrendered if they just had an assurance that that Hirohito could stay in power. And
it's a combination. The people who make this claim just will say the combination of the Russians' entry and signaling about the emperor would have produced surrender in the same time frame, maybe even a little earlier, maybe a little later, and that so it's wrong to say only the bomb could have ended the war. The other thing, just quickly, is that when they talk about saving whatever the number of American casualties, which, as you know, would have been horrendous in any invasion if the invasion had happened, but the invasion was not scheduled for until November.
November, right? Yeah.
So there was a lot that would happen. Now, again, maybe more Americans still would die here and there. Dropping the bomb certainly was quick and easy, but there was soldiers ready to storm the beaches, for many months after the bomb. So, and again, these are the things left out of the MGM movie, left out of a lot of the other things.
So anybody that wants to ask a question, I think all you got to do is press the chat button and type in your question. So I have a question for you, Mr. Mitchell. This is Adam. He wants to know, how has the depiction of war in cinema affected your view of...
so you got a question already. Okay, great.
We do. And the question is, and maybe we can both answer it.
Okay.
I think it's for you. But I'll answer it also. How has the depiction of the war in cinema affected your view of U.S. military policy? Oh, I think he's talking to me, especially as a veteran yourself. Thank you for your service. Okay. Well, I'm gonna
go for it.
Okay. Well, okay. I will answer that question. I would say that the depictions in cinema have more reinforced my feelings about the military, and that is that it's very variegated. You have when you look at the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan or the entire film, you feel very good about being an American, and you feel very good about that generation and those fighters. And when you look at a movie like Paths of Glory, to me, the greatest war film ever made and one of the greatest films ever made, it's a Stanley Kubrick film. You feel a little sickly about the military, and in particular about military leadership, which has no respect whatsoever for the common soldier and what they're going to be going through, and what their deaths will mean to, obviously, to their families, but to the country itself, to the morale of the country. And I would say that almost every war has produced a different kind of war film. The Second World War films tend to be, from our point of view, very patriotic. The Vietnam War films give you a sense of us not being the good guys, right? That we're the bad guys in most of these war films. It's not why are you there? It's what the hell are you doing there? Like we knew what we were doing there. We just shouldn't have been there. And with the Afghanistan films, I have a movie right now out about Afghanistan called The Outpost, and it really is a big question. Why? Mm-hmm. Why are we there? Why are we there in the first place? Do you have a favorite war film of all time?
Well, it happens to be Paths of Glory also. Yeah. And again, one of my 10 favorite movies of all time. So
yeah.
Also, my favorite movie, for decades was Dr. Strangelove, which again, a Kubrick movie, which might explain how I turned out writing 3 books about the atomic bomb and hundreds of articles. But in fact, you mentioned the varied treatment of wars, and even some wars have varied treatment of them in the movies. But there's only been 3 Hollywood movies about the making or the use of the atomic bomb in 75 years. The movie subject of my book, The Beginning or the End. Mm-hmm. Just a few years later, MGM did kind of a remake.
Above and Beyond.
Paul Tibbets, the pilot who dropped the bomb, and who I interviewed later, had no regrets.
Robert Taylor played him.
Yeah, Robert Taylor played him. And they had actually, MGM made used some of the same special effects from The Beginning or the End.
So, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And then there was not another movie. Again, we can talk about dozens of what you might call nuclear movies from the 50s and 60s and 70s, but they never really touched the making and use of the bomb until Roland Joffe's Fat Man and Little Boy, around 1990, which in many ways was a noble effort, but Roland made the crucial error of the real bad guy, and he was bad in so many ways. Leslie Groves, he was a racist, he was an anti-Semite. Paul Newman as Leslie Groves, and a total unknown named Dwight Schultz as Oppenheimer, who was kind of the moral center. So that movie was completely capsized. But go on.
The miscasting in The Beginning or the End of Oppenheimer was Hugh Cronin, because Oppenheimer in real life, he was like 7 foot tall and thin like olive oil from the Popeye series. Yeah. Right.
Well, and of course Jewish, and Hugh Cronin was Canadian WASP, I believe. So, so it was. My question with that is, why is this episode of which you said incredibly dramatic and incredibly important and incredibly popular in many ways, why have there only been 3 movies about it in 75 years? And of course my answer, which is explored in the book, and I think the book shows this, that Hollywood, like many other institutions, are kind of afraid to really tackle this subject, because once you get past the bluster and the official narrative and everything, and the understandable reasons that people supported the use and thought it ended the war, and soldiers who came home and everything else, it's a raw nerve. It really is. It's something that the more you look at it, it's troubling. So they
There
don't
was
want to look at it.
right. There was a Showtime movie called Hiroshima, I think,
Right.
and wasn't there. There was a TV series about the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, it actually wasn't bad. It was called Manhattan. But it was aired on WGN. That might have been their only streaming
Yeah.
series, and it really wasn't bad. But they only got through two. They only got through two seasons and up to the test at Trinity before the use of the bomb. So they never even really got to.
Never got. Jeff Katz, another one of our listeners, wants to know: given the Hollywood of the time, was an accurate portrayal ever possible?
Oh, well, that's a good question. What? Excuse me. Well, they thought so at the time. They thought they'd be able to do originally a more balanced, a more nuanced kind of movie, because there was, at the same time that people were celebrating the end of the war, the use of the bomb, there was incredible fear about the future of the nuclear era. So it was possible to be able to do both those things, even if you wanted to basically suggest that the Hiroshima bombing was okay. The movie actually ends, and I hate to have a spoiler alert here, but I suspect few will actually buy the DVD or wait for it to air on Turner Classics again. But the movie doesn't, as the movie was edited as it went along, it ended up with there's one semi-moral voice in the movie who's a young scientist at Los Alamos who occasionally raises a question. Well, he ends up dying in a nuclear, arming the Hiroshima bomb.
Mm-hmm.
He dies in a radiation accident, but he gets to write a farewell letter to his wife. And the final scene of the movie is on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. This scientist's best friend delivers this letter to his wife, and the letter is filled with all this sappy, trite, well, I used to have concerns, but now I see nuclear is the best thing that's ever happened. God has given this to us. We're going to make the best use of it. And then as the movie ends, the dead scientist who was actually killed by the Hiroshima bomb appears as a ghost and finishes reading the letter himself to his wife. So they couldn't even leave it with the original script ended with Oppenheimer going to Congress and warning Congress about the future, but instead it ends with this. So
well,
anyway.
I would, if I can just bootstrap onto that, Greg, I would say that almost no true story back then was ever accurately made. And it's for the same reason that you can't accurately make movies now. There are too many chefs in the kitchen, too many people with too many agendas, and there is you're going to have to condense time in order. You got to fit all that history into an hour 45 minutes to 2 hours. And so I would say that in the case of this movie, it was going off the rails really, really quickly in terms of having unbiased. Ayn Rand. One of the things that and we're tiptoeing a little bit, I would say, Greg, only because we don't want to explain. We want people to enjoy the book, and there are some fantastic surprises in here, and your chapters on Ayn Rand are brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
And her, especially how she is investigating and interviewing the people that are involved in this. And it seems to me going crazy as she's doing it, essentially. She wanted to be accurate. I mean, in her mind, she has her own agenda, of course. But they are stymied left and right. They're never going to be able to tell this story. I just made a military film, and I am speaking to so many different people as I'm trying to make it. The writers have written something. Now I have to bootstrap off of that in order to make the film. But you realize that there are just gigantic amount of agendas at play. And so I see there are a few more questions, but before I get to them, I want to ask you, I got several questions for you. So you alluded as we began that Donna Reed was involved in this. And the way that she got involved was that a school teacher of hers, a guy named Tompkins,
right?
he had sort of disappeared from his community. And the reason he had disappeared was to go work on the Manhattan Project.
Right.
Right. And he freaks out with what they have built and decides that the most popular way to get out the message is through Hollywood. So he contacts his old student, Donna Reed, who's now a big star, or a big-ish star.
Yeah, big-ish.
And she does bring him to MGM. How secret was what Tompkins was doing? Who knew that he was doing this? Do you know the answer to that?
Getting involved in the movie?
Well, that he was trying to get the word. How many people were involved in this freak out about
Okay.
what had been
Good,
developed?
good question. Well, there was a general freak out among the scientists, not the least of whom was Albert Einstein, who was not only worried about the future, maybe a little guilty himself in some ways, worried about the future, and didn't believe the use of the bomb against Japan was required. But all the way down the line, so many of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project formed associations afterwards around the country, what you might call activist groups.
Pardon me.
It's okay. Formed activist organizations at all the Manhattan Project sites with hundreds and hundreds of members. And they wrote editorials and op-ed pieces and feature pieces for, Look Life magazine and so on. So there was that first 6 months, there was a very active scientist movement. They were pushing for more controls over the bomb. Back then it would have been a little easier because he only had so much uranium and he had very little ways that the U.S. had discovered, but you could have controlled the actual making of the bomb more. They were more expanding the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was got a lot of press in that time. So it really was, at that time, it was very plausible you'd have a movie that would very much reflect that. But then months passed and this narrative settled in and people wanted to, in some ways, turn the page. And so the scientist movement, faded. But, again, as a sidelight in the book, we see that the scientists such as Oppenheimer, Leo Szilard, Einstein himself were seen as such threats by the government that I sort of chart how the FBI surveilled them. Even Einstein had his mail and phone monitored. Leo Szilard was followed and his mail opened. Oppenheimer had his phone tapped in Berkeley. And I have transcripts of what the taps found about what they were, what Oppenheimer was talking about.
Did you personally ever meet any of these scientists?
No, it's odd. I never met any of those scientists. It's sort of odd that the two of the people I met and interviewed was the pilot who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and the pilot who dropped the bomb on Nagasaki.
Is that right?
But I never met I'm one of the few people who's interviewed both of the men who dropped the bombs and dozens of survivors in Hiroshima.
I've got Tibbet's book signed. I got Tibbet's book signed by him.
Okay,
it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, he told me that besides not losing any sleep, he felt that his dropping the bomb and the renown he got helped him meet women. That women
is that right?
were attracted to that. Yeah. So.
Whoa. Okay. Well, I was educated by her. I took some classes with Edwin Teller.
Okay. Yeah.
At the Academy.
Father of the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah. So another question. One argument some political scientists and historians have made.
Now, is this your question or is this from?
I'm reading.
We're reading. Okay.
Question from the gang. Anybody who has any questions, go to the chat and just type it in. One argument some political scientists and historians have made for using the bomb was to stop the Soviets from grabbing territory from weakened Japan, given the fear of communist expansionism in that era. Could you comment on that?
Well, that is an argument that's made, and if the war had gone on, another month, certainly Russia would have made advances. But The fact is, we don't know if Japan would have surrendered in the same time frame they did before Russia really got started. Again, they just declared war just before the Nagasaki bomb, and then this went in. When the Japanese were deciding whether to quit, I heard, going back to my childhood, and you still hear it, Russia only declared war to get in on the kill. I've heard that, dozens of get in on the kill, as if they had no intention of declaring war. And then after we used the bomb, they decided to get in. And of course, it's quite the opposite. They were agreed to get in. And if anything, Truman may have rushed to use the bomb too. Now, and again, people, you could take an argument. You could say, well, the bomb was bad, but we did stop Russia from going further into Manchuria or even coming close to Japan.
Well, I mean,
that could be that you think was a big priority, but
that's what you're saying there is very region specific. But I've heard the argument made that merely showing the Soviets what we had chilled them out a little bit in Europe as well.
Yeah, I've never. There is a whole school of thought that's been around since Gar Alperovitz's first book decades ago. That the main.
You're talking about the book, The Decision to Drop the.
Yeah. That the title of his first book about that was called Atomic Diplomacy, and it really was that the main reason that we dropped the bomb was to show Russia who was boss in the post-war world. Mm-hmm. And I've never been convinced that that's the main reason. I feel it's one of 5 reasons, maybe, so I'm not an absolutist on that at all. But there are people who will just tell you, oh, we only dropped the bomb because we wanted to, scare Russia or show the first shot of the Cold War. And it probably was. You could say it was the last shot of World War II and the first shot of the Cold War, but it wasn't simply to send a message to Joe Stalin.
Do you think Stalin was, how much did Stalin, when Truman told in Potsdam, when Truman tells him about it, what did he already know, do you think?
Well, there is some historical debate. I think the historical debate is coming down more that he did know already. He did have spies, in the Manhattan Project. He pretended he didn't know. Mm-hmm. But I think the consensus now is that he did. If he didn't know everything, he knew, or maybe he had just learned very recently that we had the bomb. And of course, they wanted to get their own, but that wasn't going to happen for a few years.
There is a book called, forgive me for forgetting the author's name, called The Accidental President, about Truman. Mm-hmm. And it ends with the dropping of the bomb. And when you read that book, more or less Stalin had complete, not contempt, but disrespect for Truman. He mm-hmm. didn't view him as a real leader. He viewed him as, as a wuss, that he was no FDR.
Well, what's amazing, and I show this in the book, quite strongly, I think, is that General Groves saw Truman the same way. Mm-hmm. He thought Truman was very weak. He had just come accidentally to the presidency. He was not a very confident-seeming person. He was overwhelmed, in the office. And in fact, and so Groves bullied him, and most of these key decisions that Truman made about using the bomb, testing it, where to target it in Japan, was under the influence of Groves. And in fact, Groves called Truman, he was like a little boy on a toboggan in this period. Okay. Famous quote, like a little boy in a toboggan. So I guess Groves and Stalin had something in common there.
Well, it's Truman's on paper, and I guess in his personality, he turned out to be just fine, but that he was about as unpresidential as they came. And what was interesting, and this is a different book maybe, is FDR had to know that he was picking a president, or that there was a very good chance that he was picking a president. And when you look at the history of how he came to choose him as his vice president,
pushing out Henry Wallace, the real lefty.
But Wallace was maybe more presidential, but
Yeah.
the how that came to be, and it was almost irresponsible to pick Truman, except that it kind of worked out. Okay, we got some more questions for you, Greg, Professor Greg. Greg, I have two questions first for Greg. I only see one question. Do you believe we're going to ready to open up a can of worms? Here we go. Do you believe that the president has the singular authority to order nuclear first use? That is a preemptive nuclear attack.
Right. Well, I don't believe so. This whole, I referred to this policy earlier as the first use policy. And of course, the counter to that is no first use. And every so often, there's a serious push in Washington and by analysts to try to get a no first use policy put in. They tried under Obama, seemed to make some progress, and it didn't happen. And of course, not to get partisan here, but of course, this issue is raised more today. There's a new book about it, and the New York Times had a big op-ed about it about a month ago. You could check out. By what a lot of people think, we have a less than stable genius in the White House, and when he came into office, he talked a lot about possibly using nuclear weapons, or he said, why couldn't you use them? Why have them if you can't use them, and so on and so forth. So it's a very topical question, but and it can get kind of wonkish, I suppose. But the fact is that most people don't even know we have that policy, and that we can or would respond to a conventional attack with nuclear weapons, or a threat by another country like North Korea or Iran to attack us in some way, maybe not even nuclear.
The first movie I ever made was a very, very tiny film, $800,000 movie with Timothy Hutton and Kevin Pollak, called Deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about whether or not a president is going to decide whether or not to drop a nuke on Baghdad.
Right.
And so it's we're interested by the same things, which should worry people very close to us. But I would say there was in the accidental president, Truman finds out about the bomb exploding over Hiroshima while he's on a ship returning from Potsdam.
Right, correct.
He gets really excited, and in fact, he goes from one cabin to another to tell everybody.
Right.
Just worked, it worked. We dropped our bomb, and he's almost gleeful. And there is this pretty profound moment, I guess this would have been after Nagasaki, in the book, where he starts to see the footage of what had happened. And, I don't know if the book takes a position that he has now doubts about what he has done, but that he looks at it on a more human level. Was there a possibility for a third city to be attacked?
Yes, and it's actually amazing you bring this up at all, because I have an article just out today at Newsweek. If anyone's interested, you can go to the Newsweek site, and I have a piece called "Did Truman Ever Regret Dropping the Bomb?" And it goes through the incident you just said on the ship, and him then calling off a third strike. There was a third strike that was planned. It wasn't, unlike the first two. First two were basically assembly line, and we could, talk about Nagasaki as a possible war crime. Certainly, there are many people who feel Nagasaki was a war crime, and they may endorse the Hiroshima attack. But it was basically, there was no separate decision to bomb Nagasaki, which shocked some people. There was no decision it was just assembly line. After seeing or learning of the real carnage in Nagasaki, Truman actually said, put a stop to it, and made a reference to, I don't want to kill another 100,000. I don't want to burn up more kids, something to that effect, women and kids. What's interesting is, and that, again, we could talk about this for hours, but Truman, I raised the question, although I'm not confident about it, but Truman has a fascinating line in his diary 2 weeks before this, where he writes, he's just writing to himself, where he says, looks like the bomb will be ready and we will be using it in 2 weeks against Japan. Secretary of War Stimson has assured me the target will be strictly military and not women and children.
Yeah.
So I raise in the book, I say either Truman was ill-informed by his advisors, or he psychologically, he was already kind of accepting the fact that they would kill women and children. Or, he's lying to himself, you might say.
Right.
But perhaps he didn't really realize that this was the target. And in fact, I think many people today are still surprised when they learn that the targets of these two bombs were the centers of these cities. Nagasaki didn't even have a major military camp in the city. They had a naval base way out in the harbor. Hiroshima did have a headquarters, but the target was the center of the city. And so you
Nagasaki, in fact, was not the actual second.
Right, it was the second, right. It was
what was Kyoto was
Kokura.
Kokura.
Yeah. And they went to Nagasaki, but Nagasaki was on the target list and so forth. But,
it was weather that prevented them.
Yeah. But, there were a total, and everyone, I think, accepts this number, which is kind of shocking, but 200 military people in all were killed in Nagasaki. The other 95% were civilians. So the fact was these cities were targeted to kill as many civilians as possible, or kill as many people as possible. And,
well, I'm going to have a question for you that relates to that, but let me get to part two from Steve. He said he had two questions. Here's the second question. This is for me, he says. My father was a bomber pilot in World War II, trained to drop the bomb. Whoa. The bomb? Okay, flew in 807, I'm going to put my glasses on here. Flew in a B-17 over Trinity site with his crew shortly after the first test, and said to me years later that the Trinity fused sand glistened in the sun beautifully and ominously. As a military man and artist, what is your opinion about why most Americans think the use of the bomb is not ominous, and most Americans have no idea of the deadly consequence, blowback of the use of anything nuclear? Well, I think that you're probably more qualified to answer that, Greg, as the historian between us. You're the professional, I'm the amateur. But I would say that I'm not sure that I agree with the premise. I think that many of us do realize what the horror and the ramifications of the nuclear threat are, and it's books like yours that are helping us get there. But now that Steve brings this up, it does make me think that we probably have not done enough in the world of cinema to really explore this. I mean, there was that remember that I think 2-episode miniseries called The Day After.
Yeah, biggest one ever, biggest TV audience ever, maybe to this day.
No, at that time, eventually got beaten by Roots, I think was the.
Well, okay, but Day After was just one movie, not a series, so maybe that's.
Wasn't a two-parter?
No, not at all. No, one.
Okay, all right. So, you're much older than me, so I saw when it came out. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, it's funny. And this relates to it. I thought when the questioner referred to his father flying over the Trinity site after the explosion, we were going to make a segue to how deadly the bomb has been for veterans, for people in the military who were forced to participate in the dozens of bomb tests in the Pacific and in Nevada, and who were exposed to radiation. Were told to march right under the mushroom cloud, and many of them who have died from cancer and other things later, in the years after. Plus, others were put into radiation experiments.
Right, and
which was a big scandal. We haven't heard about it for decades, but 25 years ago, in fact, Roland Joffe had something about that in his film, just a reference to it, and he was just blasted everywhere for even referring to the fact that the Americans might have carried out radiation experiments on their own people.
Absolutely carried out in these islands where filled with brown people. You know, we really, and it's my second reference now to us being able to demonize, and maybe that's the wrong word, being able to marginalize the people that don't look like us, and that it's literally easier to drop bombs on them.
Right.
You know, also,
but we were used as our own soldiers were used as guinea pigs. You know,
in some cases, yeah.
Marching into these radiated, even in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm also kind of an expert on the occupation of Japan, where we put tens of thousands of American soldiers right into Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Where did you get all this interest from, Greg, in this in this particular subject? By the way, if I may just say, for the people that are watching right now, if you go into the chat room, somebody has set up a link to your Newsweek article, and so you guys can check it out after after we are done here. Don't check it out now because we're talking. But how did you get into all this, Greg? It's really fascinating to me.
Well, besides my Dr. Strangelove obsession, well, I became, you know, I mean, I'm, as you say, I'm so much older than you that, you know, I grew up in the nuclear fear of the 50s and the duck and cover and all that kind of stuff. So I certainly experienced all that, all the nuclear fears of the 60s. So, but I wasn't particularly interested in this issue until the early 1980s, when we had the great anti-nuclear movement, the Freeze campaign, disarmament. That was one of the great mass movements in US history. And then I was named the editor of a magazine called Nuclear Times, which was the Bible of the anti-nuclear movement. And so for 4 years, I was the editor of that magazine, and I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for a month on a journalism grant, wrote dozens of articles about that for the New York Times and Washington Post and many others. And it kind of set me on that path. I also met Robert J. Lifton, one of the great writers and psychiatrists of our time, and wrote a book with him, and became great friends with him. He became kind of a mentor in this. So that's how it developed. As you've said, I've written many other books in that time on other subjects, but I keep coming back to this.
So Steve, whose dad just wrote something else, was a pilot over Trinity, said, my father was not exposed. He flew over low and against the mission's plan for the day. The word was going around about the test, and the flyers knew something was really up, and why their training and new B-29 missions and maneuvers were happening. The anti-nuclear movement that Greg just mentioned has faded away for most in politics.
We led just quickly, and again, this is in the book. You know, I keep coming back to things in the book, but there's a lot in the book that's not exactly tied to this movie. But this cover up or suppression started right with the Trinity Test, because we carried out this test without warning anyone nearby or having anybody sent away. In fact, there was a radioactive cloud that drifted over, killed cattle, and probably damaged people. It then drifted across the country. The first fallout was dropped across the country. No one was ever told about this. So it started the whole decades of American exposure to radiation and nuclear dangers, which go far beyond the bomb. You know, I mean, the bomb started it, but there's been all kinds of bad things that have come out of that beginning.
Let's go back to the decision to drop the bomb in the first place. And the decision to drop it on Japanese cities was one of many options that were considered. There were other options. There was a warning option.
Right.
There was an option to drop it on an unpopulated area entirely. Can you go over some of these options and why they were rejected, and would you have preferred any of them?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the greatest, the first option that Roosevelt himself mentioned to Churchill when Roosevelt was alive. He said words to the effect, what if we just keep the bomb as a threat and never use it? You know, keep it in our back pocket. Okay,
Right. I
so
mean,
that's one alternative.
That option, if I may interrupt, would include inviting the Japanese to the desert to watch.
Yeah, that's a demonstration. I mean, that's the demonstration shot. Now, this was put before Truman. Truman was kept in the dark about most things, misled on certain things, did not have, you know, once this thing was in motion, there was very little, relatively little discussion about this, given the gravity. But Oppenheimer himself and the scientists, there was one meeting where it was sort of brought up, well, what about a demonstration shot? You know, they could do it off the coast of Tokyo, you know,
Right.
have, you know, sort of alert them into the sense that there's going to be this thing, and then they're going to see it and they're all going to like, you know, quit, you know, the next week. And that was dismissed very quickly. What if it's a dud? What if you say we're going to drop it and we don't?
Right.
You know, it doesn't go off. What if they say, well, they may not have another one, or, you know, we're not going to worry about this. So I think there's a lot of reasons to think the demonstration shot was, you know, was going to be a tough, maybe a tough sell. So I think it's these other things just holding off for the Russian entry, signaling that the emperor could stay, are more likely as the alt.
What about moving into a less populated area?
Well, they didn't have to drop it on the center of the cities. You know, they could have dropped it on smaller city. They could have dropped it on the outskirts of the city. They could have dropped it on the, you know, and actually on a military base. You know, that's one of this twisting of the narrative or setting of the narrative began with the very first moments of the of the post-war, when Truman's press release to the nation. The very first sentence said, we have, you know, X number of hours ago, we dropped a new revolutionary new weapon on Hiroshima, a Japanese military base or army base, I think he said. Not the city, you know. So in fact, the movie that I write about takes great pains to always try to show that we were Americans were decent. Americans acted with great valor. One of I chart how in the scripts they kept changing. You know, the actual missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki were carried out, you know, total secret. You might call them sneak attacks. They met no opposition. They met no opposition from the Japanese. But in the movie scripts, they kept injecting first it was they were met by flak, and then they were met by heavy flak, and then Japanese fighters appear. They also overplayed the fact that we dropped leaflets. Again, this was supposed to show American decency. We dropped leaflets warning them of the atomic bomb, which was never done.
But that is something that Eisenhower actually, not Eisenhower, sorry, Einstein actually advocated for.
Yeah. So, but like I said, the movie continually raises these issues that become are so revealing of this actually debate is now for 75 years over this question. That you know, that the movie had to sort of they even had they kept injecting the possibility that Japan had atomic weapons, that would greet our forces, and it led to the actually black humor, dark humor episode where they had a German scientist land in a submarine off Tokyo, meet the leading Japanese scientist, to give him the secrets of the atomic bomb that Japan would then be able to use against the US. And of course, the kicker was that the laboratory that he was going to go to was in Hiroshima. So, I mean, you can't make it more direct than that. You know, we had to bomb Hiroshima because they were making atomic bombs there. Now, they cut that scene from the movie. I will say they didn't end up cutting it, but.
Right, Greg, I cannot overemphasize. Let me hold of the book one more time. Okay, you guys need to order this book.
Why we're here, right? That's what.
Well, look, you know, we are here, but not just to move a book. I really want people to, you know, we're both, you're a professional historian, I'm a non-professional historian. There's never been a time in my life since I graduated from the military academy where I've not had a World War II book of some kind on my bedside. And right now it's this one. And so, I really love when people get educated on the most important event of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a singular event, is certainly the dropping of the atomic bomb, and on a vaster level is the Second World War. But we talked a little bit, but what I was going to say, I cannot overemphasize enough how much fun this book also is because of the movie element of it, and the crazy fucknuts that are running the studios and the massive egos that are involved, and how they got steamrolled by Washington.
Yeah.
By by Groves and by Harry Truman. I mean, Harry Truman had final cut over this film, which is really funny if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did they screened it for the first time at the White House?
Well, he first got involved where the producer went to meet him in the Oval Office, and talk to him and basically say, in fact, Truman said, name the movie. He says, that meeting broke up, he told the producers, well, you have my approval to make this film, and just warn people we're either at the beginning or the end. And so they said, oh, you've named our, now I don't know if that actually happened, but, and so, yeah, they were sent scripts. They made various suggestions or demands as they went along. But again, it led to this ultimate screening in Washington, right. October of 1946. Truman's press secretary sees it, comes back, tells Harry the scene really should be reshot. And that led to the, we talked earlier about the new scene that was added to the film.
I wonder why they didn't go for bigger stars. I mean, they would have been available to them. They had a studio system.
Yeah, they mentioned Clark Gable as Groves, and that didn't happen. In the book, I sort of hint there's either two reasons. One, they kind of started to lose faith in the movie, or they had to pay. They did spend an inordinate amount of money on special effects, recreating the bomb. And there was also some argument that this was one of the early examples of the docudrama genre. And they thought a big star would totally capsize it, as we saw with Fat Man and Little Boy movie, I guess.
Unless Fat Man and Little Boy would have been fine with John Goodman as Groves. Okay, Michael asks, can you talk a bit about your research process for this book, the archives you visited, books you read? Did you ever have a wow moment? And how long, and I'll bootstrap on that, how long did it take you to write this? It seems like it was a bitch to probably write and research.
Well, I'd been interested in this. I first became interested in this movie when I was at the Truman Library about 28 years ago, researching my book with Robert J. Lifton. And I was shocked they had a whole files on this movie, and they had in there the scripts and the White House edits of the scripts and the correspondence back and forth. So I wrote a little bit about it at the time, but as the years went on, I just kind of kept the big file and kept adding things. And very few people have ever written about this. So I still had kind of a clear field, but so basically I did all this research at the Truman Library already. And then I went to the Motion Picture Academy Library, which is fantastic in Beverly Hills. I'm quite certain I was the first person to go through all the dozens of files on this movie, every script, dozens of scripts. Ayn Rand's papers there, went through all her outlines.
Is that right?
Scripts, they're all there. And then I had work done in the Oppenheimer papers in Washington, Leslie Groves papers at the National Archives, Einstein, some of the FBI reports on.
Did you already have a contract for the book when?
Yeah, I had a contract, but because I had so much already done, the actual writing of the book only took a couple of years. But you might say it was 30 years in the making, but it didn't take that long to actually write it.
The director of the movie was no big shakes either. Norman, how do you pronounce it?
Taurog.
Yeah, he did like Mickey Rooney movies or.
Well,
something.
he actually, I mean, yeah, he had he actually until um, the until the last 5 years, he was considered the youngest director to ever win an Academy Award for Best Director for a little movie in the 30s. And then,
I didn't realize he was an Oscar winner.
yeah, no,
I
he
didn't
won.
realize that.
Then he did, yeah, then he did, as you said, Mickey Rooney movies. Then he did, but then he actually is most famous today as the director who made more Elvis Presley movies than anyone.
Oh, is that right?
He directed 8 Elvis movies. Um, so that's who he was.
This didn't tank his career. This didn't tank his career at all. Then.
No, he kind of, he muddled along, and then Elvis came along 10 years later, and the rest is history.
Why do you think FDR kept Truman out of the loop? I mean, he knows what his health is. He knows that Truman could become president at any moment. He knows this.
Yeah.
He's not stupid. So
Yeah.
why is he keeping him in the dark?
Well, it's it's a good question. I should tell people I'm actually, because the power is out in our county, I'm in a hotel room now, so I'm fiddling with the lights here a little.
Sorry about that,
but he, well, again, I don't think FDR might have thought he wasn't going to live out his term. I don't think he thought he was going to die before the war ended totally. He didn't really expect to die. And, he may have been, there's some evidence he was planning to tell Truman. But I think he felt, why? What was Truman going to do? What was he, how was he going to take part at that point? So,
well, only to be prepared, Greg. I mean, it's like, that term it never applied more when you're one heartbeat away from the presidency. So, Truman I think is at the House, or he's in the Congress when he gets word that he needs to shuttle over.
Yeah.
And it was Eleanor who told him that FDR had died. She said, "You're the one in trouble now." I think it was
Right.
something
like that. Yeah.
Right. And I believe it was Stimson who eventually said, I need your ear for a second because you need to know about something.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, his world must have been turned upside down instantaneously.
Yeah. Yeah.
He heard about this.
Yeah. 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 That was April, and the total decision to go ahead was with the bombing was within 2 months of that. And then you had the test at the Trinity, and then you had the August bombing. So there's very little time frame there. And I think that's why Groves thought he could bully him and, lead him around. So other people may think, may say Truman maybe didn't seem like he was in control, but he actually, ended up making the decision or going ahead with things. So I don't know.
As we start winding down, let me, I want to go back to something you had talked about before. And that was what appears to be the unilateral right and power of the United States president to launch a nuclear attack.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a process by which it is launched. It can be a rather quick process to go from the decision being made to the nukes being launched. And even then, there are safety mechanisms. We change our mind, midway through the flight. But to me, it's not written in any constitution, in our constitution, that the president has the right. We give him the right to be the commander in chief, but the rights of the commander in chief are not delineated anywhere. Do you think that maybe the Congress or the Gang of Eight or other people have to sign off on the use of nukes? Is that dangerous? Is it, or would that be appropriate in your mind?
Well, I think it'd be better than what we have now, where basically a president can do it. He's like General Ripper in Dr. Strangelove, except he has he doesn't have to close an army base and do all the things that he had to do. Well, the direction I thought you were going, and you might have more insight on this than I have, is whether generals and even the launch, the people who have to turn the keys to launch the nuclear would go along with it. And there have been different takes about, for example, hints or suggestions that a certain general or a certain commander of the bombers have said privately they wouldn't accept an order from Trump, or they would delay, they wouldn't follow, they would investigate and all that. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but it does come down to individuals have to go, they get an order and then they either say, whoa, I mean, that's a direct order. Now you could take the stance that the president does not have a right to declare war.
He does not have the right to declare war.
So is this?
That's not even. Some people say. I mean, you're saying a president can de facto declare war, but the constitutional right to declare war is 100% in the hands of the Congress. Right. It's not in the hands of the United States president.
Right.
Which is why the War Powers Act existed, at least. I don't mean to alienate anybody who's listening on any sort of political level, so I will not talk specifically about Trump. But should a madman somehow become president, who can be easily triggered by a tweet or has something to prove or an election to win, we have to be very careful, about this. This is the judgment of one human being. One of these days, we'll have a very bad human being that will make this judgment, and it will be the wrong decision.
Yeah.
To the end of the world. So it's, in my opinion, safeguards need to be put in place. I don't know why we simply accept the fact that the United States president has this unilateral right.
Right. Well, I think that's been the change over the years, because the image used to be all about retaliation.
Right.
Okay, the president, okay, nuclear missiles are coming in. What does the president do?
That's different.
Different situation. So, but I think it's also useful that people, that it was kind of amazing yesterday. People, this gigantic explosion in Beirut. There were actually people for quite a while on Twitter talking about, oh, it's nuclear. It had to be nuclear.
Look that way for
look at that mushroom cloud. And so I thought it was maybe a little lack of understanding, and this happens with every generation, of actually the size and the power of nuclear weapons, that somehow you still have this image that nuclear weapons are still just bigger bombs, and they're going to make a big display. And
what would be, Greg, how would an explosion right now manifest itself physically?
Well, of course, there are different size nuclear weapons, and in fact, it's some people think one of the more dangerous things going on today is that the U.S., and this goes back to previous presidents as well, wants to, or is in fact building smaller size nuclear weapons, which may sound like a good idea, but it also makes them more usable. People will say, oh, it's not that big, but that big would destroy Chicago.
Well, people are talking about things you can put in a briefcase.
Yeah.
At the moment, ludicrous, but that's what they're talking about. Yeah. I was just thinking as we're talking that you talked about Strangelove, and we talked. There was one other movie about the use of nuclear weapons that I think is a masterpiece. In fact, it's one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's one of my favorite books of all time, and that is Failsafe.
Okay.
Did you see Failsafe?
Oh, of course, yeah. I remember reading it in Look magazine serialized the book before it came out.
It was just an extraordinary movie, and Henry Fonda is the second best fictional president ever put on screen. He was absolutely brilliant in that film, and directed by my favorite director, Sidney Lumet. And the movie was just so tense, and mostly takes place in a room with two actors.
Right. Yeah.
Henry Fonda and Larry Hagman. And that's a great film. If anybody who was listening has not seen that film, I think it's like 90 minutes long, but it has, and if you don't know the ending is a shocker.
Yeah.
and absolutely.
Yeah. No spoiler alert on that. So.
No, we're not gonna. We're not do a spoiler. What are you working on now? What's next for you?
Well, actually, I've just finished directing my first film, a documentary about
Oh, is that right?
similar subject, actually, the suppression of this is a true subject of the suppression of all of the key historic footage shot in Hiroshima and Nagasaki right after the war by an elite Japanese film team and the U.S. military, who shot the only color footage in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then in both cases, this footage was hidden from the public and suppressed for decades. It
was just horrible footage, or?
No, some of it's horrible footage, but it's that a lot of it just shows what happened. There are buildings and there's rubble and things like that, and there's scientific aspects, but there's also plenty of military aspects. And the U.S. seized it, even though their own. I interviewed the two American officers who were in charge of shooting the American footage, and their footage was suppressed until the late 1970s.
So you directed this documentary?
I wrote and directed it. Yeah.
Did you write it as well, or?
Pardon?
So you wrote it as well?
I wrote it and directed it, and it's purely first person. It's purely about the filmmakers. So it's half of it is really the Japanese filmmakers, and the other half are the American cameramen. In fact, the American cameraman, the chief American cameraman, which you may appreciate, was born in Japan. He worked in Hollywood for a while. He went back to Japan, and then he was hired by the Americans to shoot most of their color footage. And it was Harry Mamura who shot Kurosawa's first movie. And
is that right?
That's and so he shot this color footage, or much of it, and it was suppressed for 40 years or 30 years. So anyway,
let's do one thing here, and then I think we'll probably have to call it a day. This is from Marcus. One thing that makes the bombings tough to talk about for Americans is the ubiquitous racism of the Pacific War. We've already talked about that a little bit. This film was made in the wake of a popular culture that was deeply racist and sometimes veered into genocidal rhetoric. How was race dealt with in this Hollywood film?
Well, they never. They never show what happens to the Japanese on the ground. There's no Japanese characters. There's certainly no one ever says we have to beat these yellow devils or any of the other things that were said during the war. So I would say the racial aspect is just pretty much ignored. It's just we have to beat them. They're the enemy, and it's the only way to end the war. But there's no real name calling in that sense. But you can't avoid that this was as you mentioned, there terrible, even more vicious depictions of the Japanese enemy than of the Germans. The Japanese were totally made animalistic, and so it was a lot easier to kill them. It was a lot easier to probably even kill their civilians because they were seen as just almost subhuman. And it's a factor. It's a factor.
We are interning the Japanese, and I will tell you this: if you look at Hollywood films of that era, and actually for the next 20 years maybe, is that you're not going to find one positive portrayal, I believe, other than as a servant of an Asian male.
Yeah.
You could have an Asian female. That's exotic, and that could even be a love interest, But like there was, I forgot the name of the Marlon Brando film where he has an Asian love interest, but just try doing it the other way around, where there is a white woman or American woman having a Japanese lover or a Chinese lover. Never going to happen at fucking all. Not back then. That was never going to happen.
Yeah.
And the racism toward and the xenophobia was much more dramatic than was even. And then I know it sounds shocking here, than it was even to African Americans at the time, because there were still some filmmakers who had a vested interest in making films that, like Pinky, for example, that took a positive approach towards African Americans and talked about racial injustice. It was at least a discussion from part of America. But there was no, I don't know when there was ever a film. There was a movie that Alan Parker did about the internment camps, I think. But that's a subject that's absolutely, excuse me, rife.
Yeah.
Filmmaking, and it never got made. Nobody cared.
Yeah.
It was how they looked physically that made it even easier. Now you throw onto this the fact that we were attacked by them. Because the Germans never attacked us, not in a battle sort of way.
Yeah.
So it just made all that just so much easier. So the book.
Yeah, I would just say that it just brings out the fact that people could say, and I would say, and I'd be, but it's totally understandable why Americans endorsed the use of the bomb, why they were not so upset about using it against Japanese for whatever reason. And to totally accept that, feel it's completely understandable, and understandable the way soldiers felt that they might have been killed in an invasion of Japan. But nevertheless, after 75 years, you hope for a little more reconsideration of that, and that's what's missing. People say, yes, I understand it, and people who felt that way, it's understandable. But maybe it wasn't necessary. Maybe it did send a bad signal to the world. Maybe it set us on a terrible path. Maybe Truman had his reasons, but we should know better, and we shouldn't glorify it. We've almost glorified the use of the bomb there, and I think that's the problem.
Well, I think the book is one more time. It's good. I like the cover.
Okay.
The beginning or the end. If you guys haven't read it, do so. And when you read it and love it, you rank it high on Amazon, and tell your friends. And and I'll tell you this. It's not a long book. It's less than 300 pages. And I would say that if you have friends who are history buffs and World War II buffs especially, this is a fantastic Christmas gift, and it's a fantastic birthday gift because it is so entertaining. One of the problems with some World War II books is they're very tectonic. You're just flooded with acronyms, and you're flooded with different facts and so many names. This is really a story, and Greg has done just the most magnificent job with it. So,
well, thank you.
I congratulate you for what I know will be a very successful run for the book, critical and probably commercial, and the best of luck to you with this.
Well, thanks.
With this wonderful book.
Thanks. Thanks for that, and thanks for doing this. Doing this with us. Thank you.
It's really my pleasure. And if any of you have not seen my film called The Outpost, I welcome you to see it. It's
number one movie of the summer.
Yeah, it is.
Not an exaggeration. The number one selling movie of the summer. So
that means you guys have probably seen it. So okay.
Anyway, I certainly have.